Okay, this is Jerry Allen interviewing Suzanne Lacy at Otis College of Art and Design, and it is February 25th, 2011.
I went to Fresno straight out of Vista, Volunteer and Service Training to America, and I was a psychology graduate student, and I was going to be a shrink, and I met Faith Wilding, and Faith and I we decided to start a consciousness raising group. So we posted signs all over Fresno State and asked women just to show up to talk to each other. This was around 68, I think, or 69, probably 69. And what happened was about 30, 40 women showed up, and we sat there looking at each other, having no idea what to talk about. And Faith finally turns to me and says, well, why don't we talk about sex? So we did, and we opened up the conversation to the women, and that sort of started the feminist movement at Fresno State. And then later, Judy Chicago had contacted Faith and asked her to be a teaching assistant for the feminist art program that Judy was getting ready to start. Faith told me, I said, wow, I want to join. And Judy said, no way. She said, I'm not sure if she interviewed me. I think she did an interview with me, and I was all over about going to be a psychotherapist and creativity and art and on. And she said, this woman is not going to be an artist, and I only want to deal with people who are going to be professional artists. So she didn't let me in the program, but Faith and I went on a campaign to convince her otherwise, and reluctantly she let me in. It was a transformative year, as you can imagine. I completely left my 7 years of medical, psychiatric type training and went off to CalArts the subsequent year with the rest of the women from the feminist art program. It was actually interesting how I decided to go to CalArts. Everybody was, finishing the program. It had been massively change producing for all of us. And during that time, I had tried painting, I'd tried performance, I'd tried sculpture, I'd sort of dabbled in a lot of media and created some more sculptural installation. And I remember the women started talking about going to CalArts. Many of them were still undergrads, so they were going as undergrads, and CalArts was admitting them as a group, I think, to the feminist art program. But Faith and I were in a different position because we were graduate students, and I certainly didn't want to go back to undergraduate art school. So I was really not thinking about going on with everybody, but going on with my medical career. And I started feeling really bad, like I kind of knew I wanted to stay in this trajectory of the arts. So I remember a very feverish night where all night I sort of stayed up and should I go to the art school? Should I stay on my medical track? Should I go to art school? Back and forth. And the next morning I got up and I called CalArts and said, you know what? I think I'm going to apply for the graduate program. And as I was calling, I got one of Judy's emergency interrupt phone calls. That was the way she got through when your line was busy, because they didn't have call waiting in those days. And so I got off the line with CalArts and I took her call and said, what's up, Judy? And she said, Suzanne, I've been thinking you should go to CalArts with the rest of us. I said, well, guess what? I just applied. So I went to CalArts in the design program. And the reason my MFA is actually in design is that the man heading the design program at that time and the program itself was very socially engaged and involved with urban issues, new issues of urbanization and so on. So my degree is actually in social design. At the same time, Sheila de Bretteville was starting the feminist design program, or the women's design program, and she asked me to be her teaching assistant. I went back and forth between design, urban psychology, and fine arts, production, performance art. And at one point I showed in critique a series of sculptures that Judy really liked. There were women mannequin with masks, coverings on their face bleeding off from heat melting, and bird cages inside of chests and things like, with rats on wheels and various sorts of kind of assemblages. And Judy liked them, and she said to me at the end of the crit, Suzanne, if you don't stop messing around, going from here to here to here with two or three different ideas, which is part of my character, I'm not going to work with you next year. And I didn't take it as a threat. I took it as a challenge. And I remember running around for an hour at CalArts. Everybody I met, I would just sort of grab them and babble incoherently. And then I grabbed Judy in the parking lot on the way out to her car, and I said, okay, I'm going to be an artist. And it was a very emotional, transformative moment. And I always associated Judy with kind of connecting to the heart of my own development, whereas Capro was incredibly influential on my ideas of form language, my connection to the avant-garde, the history of performance art, fluxus, happenings, and so on. So a year later, I was out struggling as an artist in Los Angeles, calling up Arlene and saying, I'll never be an artist because I don't have the free time, because I had to work as a carpenter, and teaching here and there. And the Women's Building, at that time, it was the Feminist Studio Workshop, before the building had formed. Judy, Arlene, and Sheila felt that they couldn't go as far as they wanted in terms of their educational ideas, their ability to impact culture with staying at CalArts. So started the Feminist Studio Workshop and invited Ruth Iskin and myself and Dina Metzger to join them and teach. So I started I don't think we called it anything, but it was the performance program. While I was teaching the first year at the Women's Building, I was also teaching in San Francisco. We had single classes, so I taught in San Diego, San Francisco, and LA. And that's my Cinderella and a Dragster piece came out of that kind of peripatetic experience. But you were part of the class that Faith Wilding and I taught at San Francisco Art Institute on feminism and art. I don't remember the name of it. And then Ruth Iskin, Arlene Raven, and I created a summer program for a month at San Francisco Art Institute. So you and Nancy Angelo, several people sort of came from that program to the Women's Building. What I remember the first year in particular was a project I did with the students called STOP. I think it was called SAC, Stop Artistic Constipation. And I made people do a performance every day. And it was so wonderful, and they had to manifest someplace around the building. It was so wonderful. You'd walk into a hall and there would be 3 apples hanging, you know, with some reference to Cinderella and, you know, bite me. I mean, it was like performance everywhere. And then we did this framework where we created a long white table, kind of like the Last Supper, and women came and did performances around the idea of food and eating. And so we'd set up these structures, these frameworks, and people would all bring work together. And the students, it was pretty amazing actually experience, because you know there was like one woman that was kind of cramming food down a mask, and there was another one pounding glass into a heart full of candy, chocolate candy, and there was another woman getting completely drunk on tequila and smearing whipped cream all over her naked body, and I was just like, oh my God. And I realized there was a lot of anger that came up around the idea of food. And so that was one of our class sessions. Class sessions tended to be performances. The first year at Grandview was 1973. We had spent several months getting the building prepared. Everybody did construction. I had learned construction through Judy Chicago's first feminist art program in Fresno, and you know, incidentally made a living doing construction. So everybody, when you came into a feminist art program, you had to buy boots and a hammer. So after constructing, renovating the Women's Building and inviting all of the various programs like Grandview Gallery and the bookstore and the Women's Space Gallery to be part of this complex, we had this raucous opening in '73. I did a performance called Lamb Construction. And everybody used to, from CalArts, including Capro and Baldessari, it was sort of a big boy-girl mix-it-up where everybody danced all the time. It was a real kind of evolving from CalArts moment for the Women's Building. In '74 and '75, there were 2 major events that brought people actually from around the country, but more specifically from the Bay Area and San Diego to Los Angeles. We were developing a women's performance network at that point in time. So Pauline Oliveras and Eleanor Anton and Helen and Newton Harrison, and pretty much, I think Lowell Darling got divorced at the Women's Building as a performance. Willoughby Sharp was there. That was quite controversial. With Chip Lord videotaping, and I think Chris Burden photographing, and it was kind of a guerrilla insert into the Women's Building programming. Performance grew up connected as a very critical part of the Feminist Studio Workshop, not only because of my interest and effort, but because of the scene that was growing up. And also, you know, early on, Judy had established this sort of sensibility that performance was a really important pedagogical tool. We used it both as a consciousness-raising activity, but also because I was becoming a professional performance artist, we were looking at it in its own right. And hence, feminist performance art really flourished in California in Los Angeles during those years. It wasn't made gender specific, although it had a lot of obvious specificities related to the female body. You know, from Joan Jonas, who we immediately decided was our hero after Organic Honey, who wasn't remotely interested in being a feminist, from her on the one end to Annette Messanger and Ulrika Rosenbach in Europe. I went to Europe and contacted a good number of those women, interviewed them, brought back slides and information. New York always had a really strong conduit between New York and Los Angeles. The performance scene was also important around Otis, College of Art and Design, and around Cal Arts. So there was a lot of flow between Europe, New York, Los Angeles, particularly in performance, because that's the medium where your body goes with the art. I would say that my work, formally as well as content, evolved out of feminism, and most significantly, the feminist art programs and education. I don't know if you're aware, but you know, the kind of ideas that Judy launched and were pursued by Sheila and Arlene and any number of people, Faith Wilding, over time, those ideas of feminist pedagogy actually got inserted into critical theory of education in the Freire tradition. So there's a whole discourse in education about feminist, you know, strategies for education, because they were challenging power, obviously non-hierarchical, collaboratively oriented, and ultimately public-facing. We developed in performance, and obviously from the movement, the idea that the personal is political. It got manifested very clearly in performance art, where personal narrative, which often in a classroom setting was incredibly healing for often issues of sexual trauma, but childhood trauma. So those kind of CR, consciousness-raising revelations in group that were very affirming got translated into narrative performance. But the second piece of that private was the public. And thanks to people like Sheila de Bretteville, Judy Chicago, and Arlene Raven, a lot of us were thinking about the path of personal healing and how that healing connected to a kind of a social environment and a public consciousness raising, and therefore, ultimately, public activism. And so that trajectory from ablutions, which Judy Chicago, Aviva Romani, Sandra Orgel, and myself did in 1972 as a performance on rape, probably the first time rape was introduced in a contemporary setting in the arts, particularly from a women's point of view. But that piece, which was staged around intimacy, interiority, and the revelation of closely held secrets, it was based on 7 interviews that Judy and I did of women who were raped from 1969 to 1972. And those women, by the way, had never told anybody. I mean, you can't imagine it today, but in 1972, a woman could be raped when she was 15 and never tell anyone. So I remember going down back alleys, you know, in the middle of the night to get these stories from women, you know, sitting there holding their lover's hand and for the first time telling the story. So ablutions came out of that, let's reveal this sensibility. So it's very private, very narrative, very interior. The whole setting of the piece was blood and guts and eggs and clay, and it was a very visceral kind of, the strings represented sinews and entrapments. 5 years later, 3 Weeks in May was a very different moment in terms of feminism, in terms of our knowledge about violence against women, and performatively, in terms of the evolution of performance. Other colleagues who are not feminists were also thinking about large audiences. Other colleagues, like Ant Farm, were also working with mass media. So I think predominantly Capro influenced the development of, for me, of 3 Weeks in May through his notion of framing, and not just his, obviously that was part of the avant-garde, but framing of lifelike activity. And it made sense that instead of scrubbing a floor with a toothbrush, a la Alan Capro, we could take women's activities like Judy did with her students in Woman House, scrubbing the floor into a public performance, and further, like you and myself and many of us did, taking our performative ideas, our private narrative, into a public sector, activating that sector, doing mass consciousness raising, and therefore hoping for and even exploring the idea of activism, mass activism within art. Mass media became a tool for 3 Weeks in May, working with organizations, other feminist organizations, showing self-defense, involving city council, involving the police department, creating a kind of meta-narrative around violence that was really not directed, but meant to open up a field of discourse on multiple levels, private and public. Out of that came the idea of 3 Weeks in May. I was looking at Vito Acconci's work in particular, which was influential, and the whole notion of duration and repetition and daily life-like activity. He was, I think, receiving mail in a gallery, and my first idea was, well, okay, I'm gonna put rape reports every day in a gallery at a wall, and Sheila said to me, de Bretteville, why do it in a gallery? You know, why not do it outside? So that launched me in a whole direction of public discourse, which inevitably led to engaging with public officials in various ways, and thereby gaining the media attention to create this sort of public discourse. In 3 Weeks in May, one of the things that was completely a manifestation of all the work we'd been doing was, instead of, you know, sitting around a table and everybody doing their individual performance, their individual voice within the collective on food, we took that notion into the public sector. So I essentially adopted the practice as artists of curating. So I curated artists such as yourself and artist groups. We were creating an artwork with a different set of intentions. I didn't invite, you know, the feminist art workers or Sherry or Barbara to do a performance in 3 Weeks in May because I wanted them to do whatever they wanted, but, you know, within, this was not an art exhibition. We actually sat down and talked about the role that their artwork would perform within the notion of the culture of discourse we were creating. And in their case, it was to create a moment of, we were inviting some women who were new, who were in the bureaucracies, like the Sheriff's Department, the Police Department, newly trying to forge a consciousness about violence in those areas, and hadn't in those, you know, monoliths like the Police Department, where, you know, in 1972 you couldn't even get a rape conviction unless you were half dead, and he was black, the rapist. So they were, these women were trying to create new strategies within the police department, but they hadn't talked to each other, and they didn't understand their activity as a feminist activity. So by inviting those women and politicians and feminist activists, who were, by the way, only adversarial to the police department at that time, to have dinner in an art studio in Pasadena, was to dislocate their experience from the city halls and to allow them to engage in another very intimate kind of conversation about violence in their own lives, which I led at that dinner, while in the meantime, Sherry and Barbara were walking through the space, binding feet. They were just doing these series of things where a woman, a sheriff, could be talking about the difficulty in her department of trying to get people to even understand rape as a crime, and there would be Sherry and Barbara over there, you know, binding feet. So it was a beautiful event, but the point is, when I got curated into public, what was the name of it? Public Spirit. When I was just said, Suzanne, would you like to do a piece? Where would you like to do it? And I did a piece, and it was, you know, I think in the last throes of artistic vision. But when we worked together in these large-scale performative works, we were always collaborative. We were looking, like Nancy Angelo, in equal time. We were looking at and building on each other's ideas about art form, as well as content, and we were always conscious of how people would experience this very loaded information. Like Nancy's piece, Equal Time, Equal Space, was really, I think, a prototype for the kind of work which takes the audience as participant and consciously guides them through a pedagogical and healing process within the structure of the work. That is not what was going on in other forms of performance. If you think about the way audience evolved in the early 70s, there was still an avant-garde, assaultive sensibility about the audience, which is, I'm going to do this and you're going to watch it, and I'm sorry if you can't get a good sight line, or it's too crowded, or, you know, there's not enough light for you to see. I'm doing what I'm doing, which is important, and I'm not putting that down as a sensibility, but feminists began to think through the way in which the experience of the audience was critical, because, like, for example, in Equal Time, Equal Space, we knew women who were in the audience would have had incest experiences they wouldn't have talked to anybody about. So we weren't in an assaultive relationship. We were in a, how do we spread this and allow for the healing that has already occurred within the practitioners of the work. I could also say that when I was teaching performance at the Women's Building, the people that I have stayed in long-term connection with and I'm very proud of are the women that began to develop collaborations in a way that really foreshadowed group material and the Guerrilla Girls. So the waitresses and Sisters of Survival a little later, but the waitresses, the feminist art workers, and the myriads of other, you know, the Nun and the Deviant and all kinds of temporary and collective, ongoing collective experiences you all did were, I mean, even more collective than mine. You know, Leslie and I eventually began to collaborate, and we had this sort of collaborative structure where everybody would operate within a larger curated structure. But, you know, when feminist art workers did Traffic in Women for the Las Vegas piece, Reverence to Rape to Respect, that Leslie and I did, that was, you know, that's a piece that they both exhibited independently and related to the structure of Reverence to Rape to Respect, which supported and developed and, you know, ideologically and conceptually the idea. But there was such a comfort we had in collaborating, working together, performance, you know, performing in each other's environments. And your generation is, I think, the group that really established collaboration in a way that I did not do. You know, that was not part of, you know, it's one thing to collaborate with one person, it's another to develop an entity that from the beginning is a collaborative entity, like the waitresses, and then to begin to do that work over time. I've always said that that work needs to be understood as, you know, the precursor to the Guerrilla Girls, even in terms of some of its sensibility, for sure, but definitely in terms of that core collaborative structure out of which all developed.